So one of the things I want to do before the end, because this is not just a discussion with these incredible women that are on stage this evening, but it's a discussion with everybody who is in the audience. And so I want to take a little bit of a survey. Don't be shy. No one's looking. And ask how many of the women and men in the room consider themselves to be feminist? Hey.
Oh, nice. Whoa.
All right, so I'm going to ask an even more important question, and I promise you we will defy what you think is reality by the end of this panel. How many of you think you know what the definition of feminism is? You're a little shy about that one. Hands got raised real low. Well, one of the things that I think is really important to note, that tonight we're going to be talking to some incredible third wave feminists. For those who are familiar with the waves of feminism, there is first wave, which technically wasn't feminism, it was the suffragettes. There was second wave feminism, which is what people...
We're jumping in.
Word. We're just going to go ahead and say,
We're jumping in.
I promise it's not going to be that deep. There was second wave, which would be more honestly established with an Audre Lorde, a Gloria Steinem, Dorothy Pittman Hughes, Dolores Huerta. Feminism, and then there's third wave feminism and the ever-evolving fourth wave feminism, which I'm sure will come up at some point this evening. And so what we'll be talking about tonight, and what I'm really excited to ask our panelists, is about third wave feminism, the digitalization of feminism, the evolution of feminism as we are in the digital age, right? 1995 exploded with the internet, and then the access went from 1% to 40% of people nationwide now in 2016, and having that internet connection and how movements and advocacy has changed because of that connectivity. Before we get started on the deep stuff, thanks, Lori, I kind of want to go down the line and ask, and just get a little bit of barometer since we've asked the audience. I think it's only fair to ask the panelists. Do you consider yourself to be a feminist, and why?
All right. Via my position to you, I'll take one for the team and start off. And I think it's rare that I've been in a room like this where so many folks, like maybe it looked like from here 99% of folks raised their hand when asked that question. So this is a real honor to be here, and I want to thank the event organizers for inviting us. And it's also really wonderful to be in conversation with such smart women about a topic that I happen to be very passionate about. So, no surprise here. I would say the answer to your question is definitely yes. And for me, it's never been too complicated of a question. Feminism is obvious to me, but I think that comes with a caveat, and that caveat is that for me, feminism can mean different things to different people. I know a lot of people don't, agree with that. For me, my whole approach to it is reflected by the way Feministing works, where a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about different things. They like to be in conversation with each other about topics of the day. They like to even argue with each other from time to time about what it means to advance a certain agenda, and that agenda will be changing all the time, and it's a bit fluid. But at the end of the day, we do share a common set of values around seeking gender-based liberation. And so that's why I kind of feel a strong, not only would I say tentatively, oh yeah, I guess I do, but I would say, passionately, yes, definitely, I claim this title. So that's kind of my take. But really want to say that I think it's important to be open to other folks who maybe don't feel as strongly about that label applying to them. The movement itself has had a lot of different moments in time where it's been more or less hostile to different groups of people. And so I would never prescribe my own views on someone else when it comes to this very personal topic.
Yeah, so let's see. I think I definitely identify as feminist, just because sometimes we're always looking for the term that is, the simplest and the easiest, and like culturally, we know what this means. And culturally, maybe the broader culture doesn't know what feminism means and thinks that it means something other than seeking equal opportunities between men and women. And certainly there are a lot of ways in which just the word feminist doesn't cover everything that we need to talk about when we talk about seeking equal opportunities between men and women, and seeking equal opportunities between people of all gender identities and of all sexual orientations and of all races, and the way that intersects with the search for finding the right changes to make better opportunities. You all know the way I would end this sentence if my brain were working right. But yeah, I sort of always took the idea of feminism as a tacit thing. I went to Oberlin College and I didn't take a single gender and women's studies course.
Wow.
And it didn't sink into me until I was offered the chance to start themarysue.com, and sort of was like, oh wow, I better know how to talk about this. Like, I have instincts about this, but I better know how to articulate them, and I better know how to talk about them in, I come from the world of genre entertainment and of nerd media and geek media, which is this sort of cultural minority inside and intersecting with all of this other kind of junk. And I knew I was making this site for the internet in a particular subculture that was hostile towards the idea that women even belonged to that subculture, and that I had better be articulate for that reason too. And I think that a lot of the way that I found that articulateness was through being on the internet and listening to people talk about their own experiences and articulate that, and experiences that I didn't share, and listening, and then trying to use the language and the ideas that I'd come to.
Prachi?
I can relate to a lot of what both Lori and Susana said. For me, it took me a really long time to identify as a feminist. It really wasn't until a few years ago that I started to really call myself a feminist, and I think I started writing about feminism long before I actually embraced the term. And actually, I think I started identifying myself as a feminist for the first time on like my OkCupid dating profile, and I realized this is something that people
That's a really
need
big
to know
step.
about
I'm just
me.
letting you know.
And that's when I sort of made the decision that this is a really important part of my identity. But like in college, for example, I didn't really even know what feminism was. I was like, people don't need feminism. Like, we've already accomplished so much, which blows my mind now. So clearly I changed a lot. But for me, calling myself a feminist was really about acknowledging that there's a history, a shared history of gender oppression, and there's a real system at work here, and it's acknowledging that exists, that it's still there, and that we still have a lot of work to do to dismantle its effects. And so to me, it means that I'm a person who's really concerned about that and thinking about that, and I understand, though, that this is about creating choices and opportunities for people, not just for women, but I think that for me, it's a way to identify that in myself and then signal that to other people to find my people, which all of you are. It's great to be here in a room full of so many feminists. I think this is the first time I've publicly actually talked about it, not just on the internet, with so many people and in such a welcoming environment.
I definitely identify as a feminist. I have taken a women's studies class in my time and day. And I've found that there's an interesting language about the white feminists from the 70s, 80s, 90s had this interesting language about matricide. The differences between generations were a little bit dramatic. Whereas the black feminists of the 70s, 80s, and 90s were the metaphors they invoked were my mother's gardens, or a lot of growth and building on what other people brought up. So I can understand why people don't. I can understand why people don't identify as feminists, but it's just a simple. I don't think the people who have the wrong definition should have a monopoly on the definition. Right. So I'm definitely a feminist, and you're using that word wrong.
So that's actually a really great segue. For all those who don't know, feminism is when people believe in the social, political, and economic equality of women and men. I always put women first, sorry guys. And as the Ms. Foundation has been using with our My Feminism Is campaign that Meredith mentioned earlier, is all genders, which I think is also a very interesting segue into the next question, is that feminism has evolved. Even from your mention of Alice Walker and the idea of womanism and the fact that Alice Walker said that womanism is to feminism as lavender is to purple. It is the same concept of equality. I wonder if I pose to the panel, and not to anyone in particular, speak if it moves you, how do you think today's feminism is different than in previous generations, if different at all, which I'm pretty sure you will find it to be slightly shifted? And how do you think it's evolved in the digital age, and why?
Thought. There's a weird economy of like think pieces in just general media on the internet about feminism that really inquires all these weird questions that nobody's really thinking about, but puts a stake on those things as if they're the most important questions. So some of those questions are like, is Beyonce a feminist? It's like, yes. Yes, she is. Let's move on. So I feel like sometimes the conversation in the digital age tends to the most like generalizable thing, which is like everyone loves Beyonce, duh. But also just like, she's like a great example of like how you can find the fault lines of people's feminism, because she'll talk about something like police brutality, which is an explicitly feminist issue. If you're thinking about how gender dynamics play out in our society, you have to think about how Black men are specifically targeted for who they are as Black men. Like, you have to think about gender if you're thinking about police brutality.
Absolutely. And you have to think about the effect also on Black women.
Exactly. So I feel like there's just a tendency to use feminism for like this like industry of thought that is useless. And is like not important to anyone's lives. These are not the discussions we're having, but somehow they have the monopoly on discussions online. So sometimes I resent a little bit how much the internet values like shock reactions, or just like, it's like, all right, nobody needs this Beyonce take in their lives.
Yeah,
no one does.
That was going to be my question actually to you. I'm sorry, I'm going to ask a question. But I feel like I definitely agree, and I wonder if you think is happening across digital media, across a wide range of topics, or if it's something that's specific, like to the topic of gender and feminism, because we definitely see amazing like integration of feminist issues on a lot of more mainstream media platforms, and I think in some ways that's a really important thing that a lot of feminists have been fighting for a long time, right? So it's like incorporating coverage of issues like police brutality, or violence against trans women, or immigration reform, or whatever it is that whatever the feminist issues are that you want to put on the table, making sure that those are incorporated into mainstream media coverage, and that's like a good thing. But then there is also that like weird thing that you're talking about, where it's like, wait a minute, I actually don't need you to like check the feminist box for me on like every female celebrity that will get like your clickbaity headline to give you the number of page views that you need. Like, that's not actually part of my particular politics, and I resent like you assuming that it is. So I wonder if like you see it in anyone, like if you see it happening, just like that's the digital media landscape right now, or if there's something about feminism that's like making that happen more.
I think that part of maybe why that happens is because we're trying so hard to give like a fixed definition to something that's really sort of a moving target and always has been. It changes based on the context of our society, and acknowledging different types and orientations of people that maybe we didn't always. So I think that we like so badly want to simplify things and make them digestible and understandable, and the internet especially has a push to do that with like the 24/7 news cycle. But with something like feminism, you can't so easily do that, as with any, I think, social movement.
Yeah.
I want to explore that a little bit, because feminism is complex, right? Particularly when you're dealing with a world where we have the ability to have multiple identities. And I think that gets really down to the root, right? When in fact, feminism is a moving target. It's a moving target that should be defined by the person who is defining it, whether it is dealing with representation in sci-fi, whether it is dealing with feminism in politics, or whether it is dealing with representation in general with reproductive justice. And so I'd like to explore a little bit what you think on the other side, because I know we're kind of talking about the dilution right now of feminism. What do you think has been the impact and influence of the digitalization on actually bringing the feminist movement together? And what have been the pros and cons to the larger conversation?
I cover a lot about sexual assault, and one of the things that I've noticed when I cover that for Cosmopolitan is just the power of a lot of victims being able to come forward and tell their stories. And, you know, when you can't file a police report, it's really hard, and it's hard to find safe spaces to talk about what happened to you, but these are such important conversations, and I think social media has really helped bring attention to people who might not have had a platform or might not have had anybody in their lives to go to and talk to about. So like, for example, you see like the Everyday Sexism Project, and that's I think a great example of what the best of social media and what that can do for people. And even in my own personal experiences, like I didn't have a lot of avenues to explore feminism before I sort of discovered that people were doing this on the internet. So I think it gives a lot of people who are sort of a way to sort of bridge that gap between when they're exploring their identities. Like the internet you can find spaces on the internet to do that, and I think that has been really sort of an incredible development.
I was gonna. Oh, sorry, no.
The work that I do in nerd spaces is a lot of work of that exists, or that is something you can look at because the internet allows people all over the place to find other people with the same interests that they have, in a way that didn't exist in the 80s, and even for a lot of the 90s. The internet wasn't really the internet until Google happened. And in the same way that the internet lets the 50 fans of a very specific anime get together and talk and create and do and investigate and be in that interest that they have, it is a platform, it is a completely democratic platform that just lets people talk about what they are facing and their perspective on things. And I think to me, I feel like that's the difference in modern feminism, that we have all of these voices that aren't the feminists at the top, the feminist activists at the top of the heap, the women, the people in the movement who have the biggest platform, the people in the movement who are most palatable to the mainstream, that they're people who aren't people who are otherwise underrepresented in a movement that is at its heart about underrepresentation.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I think these communities are real. Like, I want to know what you are going to say, though, so.
No, I feel like my idea is similar, is that like the digitalization of feminism, the alleged fourth wave. I don't really buy the wave theory, but whatever. I feel like the topics specifically that I've found in my personal life that has helped a lot in is sexual violence and also like street harassment. It's not like women didn't know these things happened to other women before.
Right.
We've all known. This is a staple of our lives. But there's like a momentum I feel on the internet about street harassment specifically, where it's like you'll have these art projects, you'll have these street art things, you'll have these like websites, these projects, etc., where like one of the most powerful things you can do as a human is really like listen to someone else. And when other women listen to each other about street harassment, they get emboldened. There's nothing more depressing than feeling the frustration of street harassment and knowing there's nothing you can do about it. It's always that's why I think the internet is specifically good for this issue, because it's a thing you think about after the fact always. You're never going to be in the moment so bold as to like talk back to that man who could murder you. No one's doing that. But when you have like the online space to like imagine this whole like comic series where you're like a superhero woman who's responding, or you have this art series that's showing up in your actual neighborhoods, like Tatiana Fazlalizade's Stop.
Telling women.
What was the full project? What was it called? Stop what?
Stop telling women.
Stop telling women to smile. Thank you, everyone. Like things like that, where it's like there's a momentum, there's a building around this one specific issue, and it matters that it's on the internet, it's coming to you in your life. Like these are like wheat paste kind of like graffiti things that you find in the neighborhoods you live in, not just like Manhattan, you know?
Right.
Like those are the kinds of issues I feel like the internet helps build a kind of solidarity around that you cannot get just in person. Like it really, really helps to have that be a worldwide internet movement.
Yeah, and you know, in the last 2 decades,
No, go ahead.
in the last 2 decades, we've obviously seen access. I mentioned earlier that, you know, today we have 40% of the world on the internet. It's 40% of the world, not the United States, the world. Most of us carry it in our pockets. We get it everywhere we go. And you're right. And there was 1% in 1995. Thank you, Google. And for those of us who started off with Metacrawler before Google happened.
All right.
And you have, hey, aging myself, what? So you have over 3.3 billion people on the internet right now. And so I want to follow up a question, because this is going to start digging. It's going to get deep, Lori, I'm sorry. I know you said don't go deep, but we're going to happen. For the first time, we have so much connectivity that we see movements being built on the internet. We see the Arab Spring, we see the Dream Defenders, we see Black Lives Matter. We literally see movements start online and build online, but also be amplified because of social media, right? My real question is, do you think that feminism online, as it's kind of come into its many layers, because you all write and you all podcast and you all do multimedia interactions, do you think feminism is more accessible now because it has been digitalized? And I'm using accessible in a very broad term of accessible. I'm not talking about you can look up the word feminism online. I am talking about literally being accessible. And why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, I can say yes. I think we see norms changing over time. You know, you can look at attitudes among different generations around, like, sort of the standard norm bearers that are related to feminism, and see the attitudes literally change. And then you can see exponential attitude change around the time that, you know, over the time that the internet has really become popularized. I mean, for me, 40% is actually lower than I would think. I think the digital divide is something that's really real, and I really want to do more lifting up and amplifying the voices of, like, global movements. I think that's a really interesting, like, piece of what feminism has yet to do, or can be doing more of, is like really making sure that it's truly representing global voices and that Western voices aren't speaking for all. But one thing that's really interesting is that you can even see this, like, we talk a lot about millennials as, you know, the kind of young people that are consuming media and feminist media specifically today, but actually, you know, we were talking backstage a little bit, even not everyone on this panel necessarily is old enough to really technically classify as a millennial, and everyone who's a teenager right now classifies as Gen Z. And millennials and Gen Z actually have really different and interesting attitudes around, like, feminism, the internet, sex, sexuality, stigma, gender, all of these issues. And I think, like, in a lot of the fanaticism and like hype that you see around like capturing the millennial demographic, it actually masks a really interesting intergenerational conversation and actual differentiation that's happening between Gen Z and millennials, where millennials definitely are participating in a lot of those movements that you named, right? Like even, Black Lives Matter, Dream Defenders, all of that, even like Buy Anita, they really see like the internet as a source for like political activism and change, and research shows that they also seek out like meaningful ways to take action, political action online. And then you look at Gen Z and you see that they look for a lot more social interaction online and see like social causes as a primary nexus for change online. So they're really comfortable talking to strangers on Tumblr about sexuality, healthy sexuality, being genderqueer, being gender fluid, like creating new terms for different sexualities, reblogging something about why abortion should be accessible everywhere, like things like that. Whereas they'd be less likely to take an action and potentially donate in part, donate to a feminist nonprofit, in part because they're younger and have less money, but also in part because they have a less formal relationship with the internet. It's like the water that they swim in growing up. So I think like there's an interesting discrepancy there, but you definitely see the attitudes changing and like liberalizing over time, which I think we can definitely trace to a lot of the work that people probably in this room on this panel have done to change norms in media and also push conversations from really like super nerdy, interesting, like niche corners of the internet to go wider. And we need both, right? We need like, what the next big feminist issue is. I remember even 3 years ago, so many mainstream feminists were not talking about transgender issues and rights as part of their like feminist agenda in any meaningful way, and many still aren't. But I think the visibility on that issue has been moved because of probably like really a handful really brilliant strategic thought leaders who were passionate about pushing that issue forward into the mainstream.
I think that, yes, like, obviously it's more accessible with the internet. Feminism is more accessible with the internet by definition because the internet is access. But I think that, there's also sort of a privilege gap. If you ultimately, like, you can see all these ideas and read about all this stuff, but ultimately if you're going home in a community that doesn't accept any, or doesn't think that way, or doesn't accept that way of thinking, I think that it's really easy to see a big disconnect and feel like, well, this isn't for me. Like, feminism is great for other people, or like these other people want it, and it can almost like build a sort of resentment against like people who have this or are asking for it, because you feel like your problems aren't being acknowledged, or like it's not really realistic. So I think that that's not something the internet can inherently solve, but I think that's why the internet is just one component of this whole conversation.
And do you think that's a cultural gap? Do you think that's a social economic gap? Is that a racial gap? Like, I'd love for you to expound on that.
It's all the different forms of privilege. I think that's, and all of those different things are different, like different. But like, I can tell you from my own personal experience, for example, like growing up as just an Indian American woman in like a socially conservative household, like a lot of the things I grew up, like I didn't see Indian people on the TV. I didn't see Indian people writing books. Like, I didn't think that world was for me, so I just sort of ignored a lot of it. So, for me, I thought like, oh, well, a different set of rules apply for me because this is not what people like me, who look like me, who are raised in families like mine, grow up to do. So I think for a lot of people, feminism remains inaccessible unless, like Lori was saying, we focus as well on globalizing it and acknowledging some of maybe the issues and problems that maybe like our direct society might, or our direct community might have figured out a way to deal with, but helping other people have these conversations or get out of their immediate circumstances. And so
representation matters.
Yeah.
Anyone else? So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Actually, I'm going to ping off of what Lori mentioned with the differences of generations and how generations manifest particularly in digitalization. So the term millennial. I know everyone's excited about this monolith of a term, millennial. Millennials, like women, are not a monolith. In fact, that entire generation is the key core ideal is that our identification and the sum of our parts are bigger than our whole. Unfortunately, though, there's a lot of stereotypes, and we, not your mama's feminism, had a great, alluded to it in the description that feminists within the millennial age have been lumped into narcissistic, I think was the word that was used. Lazy is sometimes words that are used. Self-absorbed, trendy are words that are used for millennials. In the mainstream, I do not agree with these words. Caveat, these are not my words. But I would like to ask the panel, and we can go down panel roll call, who associates with being millennial. All caveats, I do not, although I am, technically. Thanks. Consumer Affairs.
Thanks, Obama.
It's always his fault. For good and for bad. Yeah. Who actually associates with being a millennial, and we're not talking about age-wise, we are not talking about a gap, actually associates with being a millennial, why or why not? And then we can kind of pitch out the second question to the group. Let's roll call this one.
I feel like this is like the word hipster, where if you say, no, it's not me, then that's like the one indicator it's totally you. Yeah, so I'm going to be like, no, it's not me. Much. No, but I probably like am on paper pretty much a very stereotypical millennial. Next.
Yeah, I have friends who I just heard musing the other week, like, I think 2 years ago I was a millennial, but I think I'm too old now. Like, it's on some kind of sliding scale. Yeah. But not how that works. But for me, I feel like the most useful definition of millennial is a person who remembers more of their life with the internet than not. And that's definitely a case with me, although there's some overlap there. My brother's 7 years younger than I am, and I had a conversation with him once about phones on cameras, and he was like, cameras on phones, and he was like, what did people even do before, like, we had camera phones? And I was like, well, you had that one friend who brought a camera everywhere, and he looked at me like that was ridiculous. So there's definitely still, there's a sliding scale of millennialness, I think, but I think I would put myself on that scale.
I'm just saying I was really excited when I got my first phone with a camera. I got it off of eBay. Okay, I'm aging myself. Prachi.
I guess millennial's not really one of those terms that I sit and think about the way I do about feminism, so I've never really thought about if I consider myself a millennial, mostly because I think I just thought of it as a marketing term that people use to easily denote people from this age group who have this maybe are consumers of a similar type. But I like your definition sort of related to technology, and I think that this is a long answer. I don't really know if I consider myself a millennial or not. I guess technically I am, but I feel like there's a lot of division amongst millennials, because one of the defining qualities, I think, is our familiarity with technology, and the technology is changing every couple of months at this point, and it's just an exponential curve. So I think one of the defining characteristics of millennials is how people 2 or 3 years younger than you can have such a dramatically different relationship with technology. Yeah. So I guess if that's the definition of a millennial, then yes, I am one. I'm not sure though.
There's a Google Chrome extension that changes every mention of millennial to snake person. I self-identify as a snake person, not a millennial. Nice. Also, I just in general assume when people are talking about millennials, they're just cardoning off an ad bracket, but also that they're talking about white young people. So I just never assume they're talking about me when they're talking about millennials, even though I'm explicitly the target demographic.
So I kind of want to bite off of that and a little bit of what Susana said earlier, that pegs on to subculture. For those of you who don't know, the great thing about the internet has been this emerging of subcultures. In fact, most for-profit corporations have had a really hard time monopolizing Twitter and YouTube because subcultures have monopolized Twitter and YouTube. In fact, the person who has the largest following on YouTube is a dude named PewDiePie. Is that, I think it's PewDiePie. Thank you for correcting me. Who has like 11 billion views. It's pretty insane. He actually is a satirist with really bad video quality that follows...
Satirist.
That follows game playing, which also goes back to the fact that we had a game playing website that was bought for like $97 million by Amazon a couple months ago. And that's where the biggest focus of these 3.3 billion people is going to subculture. But subculture that has allowed for this immersion of identity, right? Which is why you have this kind of conflict you just saw on this panel about, I'm a millennial, I'm not really a millennial. Because there's been this ability to identify differently now, because there's so many different subcultures that exist, whether it's art, whether it is music, whether it is SoundCloud, or any other extension of people to be able to express themselves, whereas 10, 20 years ago, you got your music from Sony. You got your art from the museum. And you may have been able to send emails to your friends to share your stuff. And then you had things like DeviantArt that came up. And yeah, you remember it. Age yourself. DeviantArt is amazing. And you had this really amazing ability to do this. And I think, and I'd like to ask the panelists now, this has also had an impact on feminism, right? Before you had Chicana feminism, you had Sojourner feminism, you had womanism, you had black feminism, but now you have this ability for not just subcultures within video game playing and Star Trek role play, not saying I know anything about that, but also within feminism. We might have to share some after the panel. So I'd like to ask you, just to the panel who do or don't identify as millennials, how you believe or how you think in your work and what you've done, that idea of subculture and identity has also impacted feminism and the movements within feminism.
Can I just say that you're killing it at the moderator question game? Because that was a really good question. You're doing really great.
Can you
paid her to
rephrase
say
it,
that.
please?
Thanks, guys.
I'm a little bit confused, to be honest. Can you rephrase it?
Word. Yeah. I can. So, in short, what I had said was...
I'm listening.
¿Qué lo que pasó fue?
Uh-huh.
What happened was dealing with subcultures and the emergence of subcultures as it reflects back on feminism. How has that impacted how feminism manifests on the internet?
I think it's safe to say there are some subcultures on the internet who have not taken the emergence of feminism on the internet very well.
Well said, well said.
Very true.
The movement that I shall not speak its name, but
Don't tweet this. Do not tweet this with my handle.
yeah, please no.
Are you guys talking about Gamergate?
Do not invoke
you,
the
Heben.
name.
No one tweet this. Seriously, no one.
Seriously,
Please,
don't
please,
tweet.
actually don't.
She won't hear the end of it for 2 or 3 weeks, guys. Don't tweet it.
But I'm here from the nerds. I mean, I'm not the only person here from the nerd subculture, but
We're cool.
You're
But,
among your people.
we're all
It's okay.
cool.
yeah. But I watched this sort of one of the things I always wonder about the Mary Sue is whether whether stuff started happening with feminism nerd culture at the same time that I was doing it, or whether I just became more aware of it because now I was in it and it was what I was doing. I talked while I was at the Mary Sue. I talked to folks who work for ThinkGeek, which is one of the biggest sort of nerd apparel, tchotchkes, etc., retailers on the internet. And I would talk to them at cons, and they'd go, over the past year, we have noticed that when we put jewelry on the website, it sells out. That we experimented with a makeup line, and it sold out. And we're noticing this. Like, we're noticing, like, that what didn't used to be the case. And we are now noticing women being in these spaces and demanding that they be recognized as a part of this subculture.
Well, Mac just came out with the Star Trek makeup
Yeah,
this week.
Mac has done Archie. I'm pretty sure they've done Wonder Woman. That it's like happening very slowly. One of the things that happened within, pretty sure 6 months of the Mary Sue launching was DC Comics announced its first really, really big reboot since 1986 in 2011 called The New 52, and they announced 52 new titles with each at least one writer and one artist on each of them, and there were 2 female creators on the whole list of people who were working on a universe that is supposed to be like heroes of the modern American mythology. And in 2011, DC did that, and it was a big deal. People noticed, people called them out on it, and the company is and that has been a consistent thread at DC and Marvel, who make up, I'm pretty sure, still around 70% of the American comics market, which is its own tiny subculture. But it's also a subculture that is continually being tapped for and pushed to the mainstream. You know, the Marvel movies are the biggest things in any summer blockbuster season, and outside of the summer blockbuster season, because we get them in March now, and we get them in November. And that's not something that might have happened in 1995 or 1997 or even 2005. But it happened in 2011, and DC and Marvel have not been able to escape. Escape is maybe a strong word. But when they do their line-wide rehauls, which they do very often, the question of creators of color, characters who aren't straight, characters of color, like where people are paying attention to where their line is just straight white dudes. And that is because the internet has allowed people in that subculture to mobilize and talk about and say, hey, I grew up going to a comic book store as a woman and I never saw any other women there, but I'm on Tumblr now and I reblog stuff from women all the time, and I know that we like superheroes and I know that we want this stuff.
So, quick question, just directed towards this. Caveat, I write for Black Girl Nerds. I am a nerd, so this is going to be a nerdy question.
Yay!
The new Wonder Woman came out, and this may be a question that will be elaborated on a little bit later in everyone else's question, and there was a little bit of backlash because the Amazons, for anybody who knows the Amazons, Wonder Woman's an Amazon. She came from the Amazons, just making sure. Okay, everybody's there, okay. And in the original comics, there were women of color. In the promos, there were none. And so going back to this idea of accessibility and feminism and how it manifests, particularly in nerd culture, for those who don't know, she was talking about Gamergate and the exposure of a culture of gaming where it is very hostile towards women. It is also within the cosplay world where it's extremely hostile, not just towards women, but towards women of color. And I'd love to get your view, and I definitely want to hear from the other 2 panelists on the idea of the manifestation of subcultures. You are not off the hook. But I'd love to get your view in particular about what are your views and how you combat this within the nerd realm, because it can be very seclusive and siloed. What does it look like for access to feminism within representation within that realm to have inclusive feminism? And what are the challenges that you deal with?
I mean, there are challenges of, there's that chicken or the egg problem, right? Where you were talking about not being able to, not realizing that you could do a thing because you didn't see the thing ever. And so there's that problem of, well, maybe I grew up and I don't see Latino superheroes in comics, and I don't see Latino creators in comics, or Latina creators in comics, and so I think maybe that's not something I can do, or maybe maybe superheroes aren't for my kind of folks, and then maybe you think, well, I don't want to write comics, I want to do something else, and then you wind up with this generation of comic writers who are the people who identified with comics when they were kids, And because it's a subculture. Even the creators of comics are subculture, are folks who identified with that subculture. And if you can't, so it's that like thing where you don't wanna, you want creators in comics are where I am from. So I'm sorry, like this is pretty universal to a lot of media, but comics is where I am from. Is that you want creators you want characters who represent those minorities, but you also want them made by people who can actually speak to those perspectives. And that's kind of a chicken or the egg problem. I'm pretty sure that there's only one, I'm half Puerto Rican, I'm pretty sure there's only one Puerto Rican superhero that has ever been at DC Comics. His name is Vibe. He's on The Flash right now.
Yep.
I don't think he has a costume yet, but he has superpowers and he's definitely a character. But like he was introduced as a member of like the Justice League International or like the West Coast Justice League or something. And like he's a like break dancing street gang member from Detroit in the 70s, and he died in like his second issue, and like.
I mean, that's the same problem we had when the next Spider-Man came out to be African American.
Yeah.
People flipped. And so and we don't have to answer the question now because this subculture can be very interesting. But it is very interesting to see how representation comes out and how feminism, and we won't even talk about costumes and characters, but.
I mean, I feel like, so everyone here is a media maker, right? This is a panel of media makers. We're not just all, we're not feminist activists from all different backgrounds. We all have some hand in creating culture of some sort by virtue of our position as media makers. And so I think it's definitely a relevant question. And it's really easy to, take pop culture or representation or media and say, well, that's a byproduct of like the real issue, or that's not like real activism or whatever. But I think really at the end of the day, what subculture is about, what media is about, is telling a story that actually sets a norm or a value. And that for me, I mean, I go back to the beginning. Like when I stumbled upon, I'm not the founder of Feministing. I run Feministing now. It's a 12-year-old blog. It was founded by actually two sisters who went and Googled young feminism because they were frustrated at their feminist nonprofit job that they were just bringing coffee to people and didn't have an active role in setting the strategy for the organization. So they Googled young feminism, didn't find anything, and they started a very, they know that I say this, a terribly ugly blog. I mean, we're talking about, way back in 12 years ago, it's like very basic. Like
Tell me how you really feel, Lori.
No. I mean, I show you guys up here, you would laugh. And it's evolved, right? Just like feminism. And I think so I first encountered the blog as a reader, right? As a consumer of the media. And I was in college, and I was around a lot of boys who really knew a lot more than me about everything, and it was like this haven, right, that was a community. And I think you don't want to, like, there is no distinction between real life and online communities anymore. That's a false dichotomy. Online communities are real communities, and a lot of us have, we circle each other in the digital world.
Me and Lori met on the internet.
We met on the internet, but obviously, like, now our like real life friends or whatever, like whatever that means, that's fake. These communities are real. The emotions that they generate are real, and I think the idea, even that some things are like alternative or subgenres, has kind of been blown out of the water by what we've seen. Where when people connect strongly to something, to an emotion or a comic book or an opinion or a value, you can kind of find your freak flag in so many people and connect with them now that it's sort of a construct, the idea of like a subgenre in our age. And
I'd love to get a shirt that says "Find Your Freak Flag," though.
Oh my gosh, can we make those?
Yes. Prachi, so you write about feminism and politics on Cosmo. And I'm going to call you out. I'm sorry. Cosmo has made a 360-degree turn with really focusing on some really tough issues in the last couple of years, and you've really been leading the charge. And it's been incredible because it's not the stereotype. which unfortunately it probably wasn't the stereotype the entire time, but everybody wants to lump things into piles. But you do the hard work. You've been talking about politics and feminism in a space where it really exposes, with the reach that Cosmo has, so many women and men to some issues that are really key. So I'd love to get your take on the kind of the impact of culture and subculture and access. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, one thing that I think my writing and what writing specifically for Cosmo has really reaffirmed is I question the whole idea of like a subculture. I mean, maybe it's just a poor term, maybe this is semantics, but like I think that what I've learned through my writing and reporting is that a lot of these experiences are really universal, and when you identify as, you know, something, whatever race or orientation, age, whatever, you don't see yourself as like a subculture or as a minority. Like, you see yourself, this is your life and your existence. And I think that one thing I try to do in my coverage is speak to that. So there are universal experiences from everybody's reality that I think can unite stories about two totally different people, or two people who on the surface seem totally different. And you know, similarly, I think that the internet has helped blow up the idea of like subculture as being this minority, small, tiny niche community, because, you know, when you talk about a subculture, you're talking about like a subset of some major, bigger mainstream culture, but like that is what our mainstream culture is. It is all of these different people and all of their experiences. And I think what we are learning through the internet, and one thing that I think we do really well at Cosmo, is we cover that range of experiences and show that this is all part of the mainstream. None of these are like these super abstract, niche, unrelatable things. This is like the human experience, and I think that all the feminism and politics stuff that I cover is pretty relatable to everyone's life in this country. So,
well said. Heben.
Hello.
Hi.
What was the question again?
Say whatever is coming to your mind right now, Heben. I'm actually curious.
That's a disaster.
No, actually, the question was talking about how the manifestation of this access to, and let's X the word subculture, because I think all my panelists have X the word subculture. How the expansion of the ability to actually have a dialogue with those who have commonalities with you outside of your small physical friend space to the world, whether it's through hip hop or feminism or through comics or through politics or fashion, how that has changed the larger conversation around feminism.
That's a large question.
You're welcome.
I see you, girl. I see you. I think in general that podcasts are like a pretty intimate medium. That's the medium that I work in. And like we're in people's kitchens when they're cooking, and they go to the gym and they listen to our podcast. So I feel like I'm a very intimate part of people's lives. So that's huge. But there's not another medium I've worked in where I've gotten that kind of access to people's lives. So that's important. And then on top of that, I have found in my life as like a writer / podcaster, blah, 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 that there, even no matter your dexterity in writing or whatever, like on the internet versus how you talk about an issue or a topic with your friends, which is what we really try to like replicate on our show. It's like our show's called Another Round. It's supposed to be like you are with your friend drinking, talking about like your week. And the way you talk about important social issues that really affect your life to your friend versus how you read about it on the internet are very different. So I think a lot about that, and I think a lot about what can be learned from the kind of patience people have when they're just like, I'm just listening to my friend talk about this, which is way more patient than the internet patience cycle. And I really appreciate that. Like, I don't take any of those minutes for granted. It takes a lot of energy to listen to 50 minutes of a podcast and like write some hate mail about it. Like, you took your time, sir. So I really appreciate that people are so invested in it, and like the medium really helps me. I think me and Tracy think a lot about like what are like some of the everyday things in our lives that we think about that are like manifestations of basically feminist theory. Like there's a lot of those things. So we try to replicate on our show, and in general, I think the internet is great at this, is like just finding feminist actions in your day-to-day life. I don't ever claim to be like changing people's lives, but I think sometimes in your day-to-day, you need to be reminded of the little things you can do and the little revolutions you have and the little pieces of solidarity you have with someone else. Like those are the things that are important to me. I think that might have answered the question. Maybe.
I would say yes.
Yeah.
So all of you have established the fact that you are digital mavens. Like I don't. Does anybody disagree that these are some digital mavens up on the stage right now?
I'm a maven.
Maven. Yes, you are. I went at the source for that one. But your voices, and I think we've established that each one of your voices has its really amazingly unique flavor. So just kind of turning it over and getting towards culminating all this great information you just gave us, I'm sure, and I would love to, but I'm sure the audience would love to kind of hear about your own personal experiences. Because the internet, as you mentioned, it's real. It's got real emotions. It's, as Heben mentioned, it's passionate. People write 5-page emails. Like, they spend hours. And you're talking about some of these 5-page emails have no typos. Like, it's impressive. English majors somewhere just writing hate mail. But I'd love to hear, and we touched on this a little bit with Gamergate, we touched on this a little bit with the ability of access, but I'd love to hear your experience with online relationships. Particularly with movement building, you built Mary Sue. That is a movement. Like it's not something that, I decided to start a website. No, you started a website who has a readership. You build out a podcast, and there are thousands of podcasts, but you have a popular podcast. Y'all are cool too, but I'm just joking. I kid. But also with advocacy and opposition. Because sometimes, particularly with feminism, we write about things that people don't agree with us about, right? We talk about things that people aren't there. And so I'd love to hear from the panelists, and not everyone has to speak, your personal experience and how you've dealt with the idea of building relationships online. But also talk about the good and the bad. Talk about the ugly, because this isn't all sunshine and roses. You didn't just get one piece of hate mail, I'm sure. Beyonce even gets bags of hate mail, let's be real. And everybody loves Beyonce. They do. So I throw it out in no particular order if it moves you. Step up, step back.
All right. We're talking about relationships, and for me, when starting the Mary Sue, when it was just me and Jamie Freverly, my intern, who eventually became an editor, and there was literally 2 people, my biggest worry was forming a relationship with our audience and doing it immediately, because I'd spent sort of my childhood. I didn't like Wonder Woman until I was an adult. I thought Batgirl was kind of lame because at least Robin picked a different costume and a name. And that all came out of the fact that from a very early age, I was into fantasy, I was into superheroes, I was into science fiction. And when people tried to do fantasy and superheroes and science fiction for girls, I found it to be super pandering, and I found it, and also the stuff that was aimed at girls was not science fiction or fantasy or anything that I was interested in. So I had this very knee-jerk reaction to anything that appeared to be aimed at women. And I figured that probably a lot of the other women I was trying to reach had also had that experience. And so the process of making the Mary Sue was a process of trying to visually and immediately communicate that as soon as you hit the front page, the people who had made this were people who shared your experiences, at least in some way. It was definitely sitting down with a designer and looking at the guy who designed our website and looking at me like, no, we can't put a floral motif on this. We really can't do that. And I guess we're also talking about online relationships, is that I made some very cool, connections through the Mary Sue. I made some a chick showed up one day and sent me some links to her blog and said, can I review video games for you? And I said, I can pay you so little, I'm so sorry, but if you want to, yes. And she's now a very close friend of mine. I have met her in person once because she lived in Iceland and then she moved to California. And she's like about to publish her second book, and her first one has like 2 nominations for awards, and it's fantastic. Her name's Becky Chambers. Her book is called The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. It's fantastic. And it's made me other relationships with other women, and those are the relationships you have when the people who don't like what you're doing show up. And those are the relationships you go to for the people to go, this is happening to me. And they go, oh, I know that's happened to me too. There's nothing we can do about it. Because there really isn't.
Can you elaborate what you mean when...
Sure.
Just for those who may not know.
I mean, we moderated all of our comments on the Mary Sue. We didn't have someone who was their particular job. And having the job of having to look at all the mean things people say on the work you did is not a great part of the job. And it's not a great thing to look at your real-time traffic modifier and see that a bunch of that traffic is coming in from 4chan, and it's on a post you published yesterday about like a gay character in a video game, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's what your next day is going to look like, is that situation. And there, it was also like, starting the Mary Sue was also my first encounter with the sort of subset of, well, I like pink things. Like, how dare you criticize, this pink controller for women? Well, I like pink things. Pink is fine. What's wrong with pink? Or, I like sexy Halloween costumes. You're really oppressing me by suggesting how neat this website is that shows you easy DIY ways to make Halloween costumes of famous historical female figures. You're you're slut shaming because you're providing other options argument.
It's always 2 sides to the argument.
Yeah.
Just saying.
And to have formed relationships online to other people is how you. It's the double-edged sword, You're putting yourself out there, but you're also making more connections, and those connections help you with the putting yourself out there to a big, wild, unregulated. Unregulated isn't the right word. But
no, it's all right. It's the right word.
I mean, I'm interested in what folks see. I'm sure there are folks who can speak like a lot more to this. Trolls are a problem online, right? Women who write online, everybody here knows this, very, very frequently experience harassment that can sometimes be extreme, rape threats, death threats, things that you would be surprised and horrified to know, that can feel very personal. There's a lot of really great writing about this, which is one of the upsides of like having a feminist internet, because people can like expose that stuff and be like, no, I'm not gonna take this in silence. So I think like the troll problem is like well documented, and folks can check that out. For me personally, some of the most painful like spats I've had online have been with like other liberals or other like people who are theoretically in solidarity with me, or solidarity, in theory also progressive and stuff. A lot of guys who just have a different opinion about how we should move the feminist agenda forward. I'm being so diplomatic right now. But some of those can be the most painful, right? Because it makes you take a step back and say, like, we're supposed to be in community together. Why can't this person understand that, I'm an expert in my own experience and they are not? And one of the things that's been amazing about being part of the Feministing community is that they've really like expanded my idea of what an ally is, because I think even though all of us are kind of sitting up here as glowingly speaking about digital media, it actually still is very, very white and male. Like I just realized we like skipped over that part because I think we're all like on the same page about it, but like media is extremely white and male. Like the bylines are not anywhere close to equal. There are a lot of great groups doing work to change that. The Op-Ed Project is a great group that trains young women. I've recently started working with Echoing Ida, which is a great organization and project that media trains young Black women and helps them place their pieces in different mainstream media outlets. Really, there's really awesome work being done around it, but it's still a huge problem. And so it's still really rare to be in a newsroom that values diversity and that like puts their money where their mouth is when it comes to diversity. I mean, like, I'd love to hear others' perspective on that who work at more mainstream organizations. Feministing is not my full-time job, so it's a labor of love. We're all friends with each other and we all support each other. And one thing that we've started doing that might be interesting to this group is that when shit hits the fan online, like if someone comes after us for a post or is really attacking, especially women of color writers tend to have their authority questioned a lot more frequently online just by virtue of speaking their truth. And so what we've started doing is stepping up to the plate when someone else's identity is wrapped up in an issue with a troll or a critique. So, for example, recently we published a piece about the transmisogyny that was inherent in Silence of the Lambs and how feminists were and weren't able to react to that. And one of my co-leaders, Joss Truitt, wrote this brilliant, amazing post. You should check it out. It's super interesting. She's a genius, and she didn't feel like dealing with the ignorant comments that followed her publishing this really personal piece about where she mentions her tattoo and she mentions her personal experience of basically coming into her identity as a trans woman. And I was like, you know what, I'll take that. I'll deal with these disgusting trolls. And if something happens where my racial identity feels really on the line or feels raw or attacked, she has the skills, because you have to build skills to be an ally, to be a media maker that can respond to different topics quickly. She has the skills to talk adeptly about race and deal with a crisis communications response out of race. So it's really important to impart these skills on younger people, build up diverse newsrooms and crews, and build those relationships, because you end up learning a lot and also being able to support each other better. But I feel like I'd love to hear from folks who work at more mainstream groups too about it.
Targeting me.
I'm sorry.
No.
I mean,
So first of all,
you didn't have that look on your face like you had something to say.
You did.
I do. One of the things is that it cannot be overstated how white newsrooms are and how basic they are. The bar is so low. So low. I hope everyone understands what I'm saying. Very low. It's truly depressing.
How low is it, Heben?
So low. So one of the things that I think has been crucial to our audience building is that we get to center ourselves in our work, which is very, very rare. I've never worked in a media organization where I was assumed to be the target of my own work. If you just as a what do they call it? A thought experiment. Just think about the last time you saw a headline where they implied the second person, you, and you actually felt like the you was you being addressed. I've literally never felt that, ever. There's a way that news people talk where you just don't assume they're talking to you. So things like that, being able to center ourselves in our work, I think that's the most crucial part of our success. People feel that immediately. And it's also, I've learned, very rare for white people to have to think about someone else's humanity, because they're always the narrative presented. So when they're you have to see the humanity in us instead of the other way around, they're like, huh, interesting. So I've been very glad to help white people on that journey. And And I do think that is a really important part of community building, when you don't feel like you're the alienated community, when you feel like you're the person being talked to, where you don't feel like the references are being explained down to you. Like, I'm so well-versed in white people's references, so well-versed. Like, you have to be a person who works in media, but they are not at all well-versed in our biggest pop culture figures. In fact, they're often very flippant about how little they know about them, and it's very, very frustrating. For example, D'Angelo had an incredible album that came out recently, a few months ago, and I saw so many white people who work in media who were like, "Who's D'Angelo?" That is an example of like the kind of like centering that happens. Like, you can be a person who writes about music professionally and also have the opinion that you don't know this incredibly important pop culture figure for modern R&B. So I feel like just community building in general is like, there's a real reason why people have not a good relationship with media. Like, that's an important skeptical relationship people have, and it's also something I have as a person in media. Mm-hmm. Like, that's how I come into the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Particularly, and it's not just media per se and writing media or what is digital media, but it's actually, and this was something that was brought up the other day on a podcast, is that African Americans, Latino Americans, AAPI used to not exist in sci-fi. Like, they were not in the future. Like, the future came, the world ended, there were no people of color. If you don't believe me, go watch some black and white sci-fi films. Weren't there. But then when you have ideas like Octavia Butler, and you have Star Trek trying its best to do what it could do, when it could do it, when the lines actually made it on air, you have this question as to how do you expand out the narrative and how do you bring it out. So I think you make a really good point about the importance of representation and inclusion in the conversation, even when it comes to the definition of feminism, and not throwing a definition down someone's throat. Because obviously my idea of liberation is not yours to define. And so I'd like to segue into some thoughts from Prachi, if you have any thoughts in regards to your online relationships as well, just because even as we speak here, African American women, Latina women, but there's a larger conversation about the diversity of AAPI women. You're talking about 19 million Americans that are stuffed into one racial category and speak like 150 different languages. And so I think it's just very interesting, and I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I feel like everyone's sort of covered a lot of what I would be like interested in saying, or my perspective. But one thing is that I feel like in my own, this is something I'm still learning how to do, I think, and will probably be for a long time. But I think that my instinct when I got into journalism was to explain myself. And sort of to your point, like, I felt like I was really being a translator, or oftentimes working really hard to try to do that, and that was something that was encouraged. And now I think I'm trying to take a step back and focus maybe less on explaining and speaking to realizing, like, going back to the subculture idea, that the ideas or the points of view that I have and believe in are not specific to me, that there are a lot of people out there who do get it, and I don't need to try to translate everything that I write to make sure that, like, everyone who is reading this on the internet is going to be able to agree. Like, that's never going to happen. I mean, when you're writing, and you're especially writing something political, it's just not going to happen, unfortunately. But, like, our audience is so diverse. Like, we had a Cosmo reader night a few weeks ago, and it was the first time that I had met face-to-face, like, some people who are actively politically engaged and read our website regularly, and it was amazing just to see how diverse that group was. So now I keep that in mind when we're doing stuff for coverage, and I'm just like, yes, I don't have to translate all the stuff that I thought I did. So that's evolved. That's how my relationship has evolved a little bit.
Awesome. Well, it's now your turn. So we're going to have two amazing folks from the Brooklyn Historical Society with amazing wireless mics who are going to go around, and we're going to do this elementary school style. You guys remember you raised your hands? You can do this. I know you can. Look at that. We have one hand raised all the way in the back. It's catching on quickly. Don't mind me. I have jokes. They let me have wine before the panel.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm organizing a march for the summer from New York to DC in protest for the Equal Rights Amendment. And thank you. And I was wondering, because we're trying to get to the level of Congress people, and just because we live in a digital world doesn't mean that they still do. And I was wondering how we turn hashtags and likes into boots on the ground and getting people physically involved.
Lori.
Well, thanks for the question and thanks for your work. It sounds really exciting. I think it's really interesting to think about what meaningful action looks like right now. And I am a communications professional, and that's my quote-unquote day job. So I'm always very keen to look at tactics versus goals, right? So in a big sense, marches and tweets are both tactics for a goal. And so I think if your goal is around the Equal Rights Act, I think it's really crucial to get folks riled up in whatever way possible to achieve your goal. And my opinion on this tends to be that the more tactics you have at your disposal, the better. So as long as you keep that North Star goal in mind, then it's sort of the more the merrier in terms of the tactics you can find effective to get there. I know there's a lot of folks who feel really strongly about like hashtag activism, or some people have more disparaging phrases with which they so again, trying to be diplomatic, like armchair activism, slacktivism, like I've heard all of these things. For me, like I said, I think you're talking to a panel like diverse media makers, so obviously we place a lot of, we think that like community norms and values and stories hold a lot of water and have an important role to play. I don't want to speak for everyone, but for me, I think that there's an important role to play in that. And personally at Feministing, we've seen a lot of like offline to online action happen. We actually, were very involved in, I don't know if folks in New York remember the rape cop protest that happened, a few years ago. There was a police officer in New York who was called to assist an intoxicated woman and actually ended up raping her in her home. And there were real life protests that happened that were paired with very infuriated coverage online. And so I see the distinction as very superficial, to put a fine point on it.
Hi there. Great panel. But my question is actually based on a podcast that I also listened to recently. Long Read had Gia Tolentino as a guest, a writer for Jezebel, and she had this great definition for what it feels like to be a minority writer sometimes, where they call on you to talk about the offense versus the opportunity. And as a minority designer, I sometimes find that I'm put in positions where, as Prachi said, like you're called upon to translate or to intervene. So I wanted to know what it's been like in your experiences when you're put in that position of educating other folks. And just to add, one of my favorite things that Crystal West says from the read is, it's not my job to educate you, but sometimes you're put in that position. Yeah. So curious to hear your thoughts.
All right, I'll go for it. I think that, in the beginning, I found that I was in my life like so used to being put in that position. Like it wasn't just in this media role, it was throughout my entire life, like growing up in mostly white suburbs and white communities. I was so used to doing that at first it didn't feel weird. But it started to when I saw that there wasn't a lot of representation around me, and I was sort of becoming like the token spokesperson, and I actually started feeling really uncomfortable when I was invited to like talk about things or on things, because I was like, oh gosh, people are gonna think that, like people are gonna misinterpret this or think that like I'm now speaking for my entire race, or like this is what all Indian women are like or something like that. But I think what helped me a lot was connecting with other people in media and other writers who are struggling with the same things, and just hearing again and again and again that no, that's not your job, and being told but that from people who get it, who look like me, who have gone through this, who can relate to that, and being told again and again that's not your job, and you're not speaking for everybody, you are just speaking for yourself, and people will be attracted to that authenticity because they'll find something that they can relate to. I think it was just a matter of starting to believe that, and that really only came over time. In terms of when you're put in that situation, I wish I had better advice. I don't, to be totally honest with you. I think it's still always tough, and for me, I usually have some sort of an internal dialogue when that happens, and I think recognizing that it's happening is really important. So for me, if I can't necessarily get out of that situation, as long as I can acknowledge that this is happening and then feel like I'm still making a choice about whether I'm participating in it or not, is really powerful. And then talking about it every time it happens with somebody who I feel like gets it, and then sort of evaluating my options and decisions. So that way it's still an active choice that I'm making, and I'm understanding why I'm making it. So sort of reframing the conversation, at least for myself, is important.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I just also listened to your 1-year anniversary special today. Good times. What up? So sort of like what you were saying about the march, and I also had started to try a Twitter hashtag thing that didn't quite take off, and it's always really challenging. And what I'm also curious about is, what's the role of men in this space of feminism? And I've recently, because I'd started to get more visible with my friends and mostly with my female friends, but I've talked with a few of my male friends who are thank goddess, wonderfully feminist identified men. How do we amplify their voices as well? Because I think that feminist men are really wonderful allies in our work as feminists.
So I'm going to break the moderator code right now. So a feminist is a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of all genders. That does not mean a man who identifies as a feminist is an ally. That means he is a feminist. My panelists may disagree, which is totally there, because feminism is about being able to come together with different ideas and being diverse and inclusive. But what I do not agree with is giving someone the key to the city because they've identified as a feminist. Just because a man identifies as a feminist does not mean he has erased all privilege. I think what has happened is that there is a conflict between the identification of as being a feminist, as in you're doing something special, and you're not. Just because you believe in equality doesn't mean you're doing something special. It means you believe in equality and you're a human. Congratulations.
The bar is so low. So low.
Thank you. And so I think the problem comes in is when women are like, oh my God, he's so dreamy, he's a feminist. No. Oh my God, you should be a feminist anyway. So I think, it's a very interesting thing where you have this narrative, this dialogue where men go, I wasn't a feminist until I had a daughter. Or, I had an epiphany. I'm totally a feminist. It doesn't work like that. And I think that's really the borderline, is that there have been a lot of those who are inauthentic feminists who just say it because it's the cool, trendy thing to say and that it's going to get them girls. Instead of truly understanding what the belief is, because I think there's another key part of the definition, is that it's the belief, the true core belief that women and men are equal and that we should have the same opportunities. And so I'm going to stop breaking the moderator code and see if anyone else has anything to add to that.
agree with everything that you're saying, and I would add that I know a lot of guys who are feminists, and when push comes to shove, they say, "Oh, well, I really wanted to say something in that situation when you stepped up and like called a person out on it, but I was just really nervous that I would say the wrong thing, and I didn't want to be the male feminist." And usually my reaction to that is, "What? Like, I was there and I was alone, and you were there and you didn't do anything." Like, it is a tricky thing to exist outside of to be an ally and not assert your whatever perspective on the thing is over the folks who are part of that marginalized community. But it is a thing that you actively need to do in order to consider yourself an ally. The first two rules, the principles that you need to abide by are to listen and amplify, and to make that if you're in a space that you don't think is that you are welcome in and other people aren't, and you recognize that, is to work to make that space a welcoming space for other people. That's what you do, and to sort of be so nervous about it that you don't do anything is just another form of like not helpfulness and of like obstruction.
Yes, the number one thing men can do as feminists is ask themselves, how can I be useful? Which they're often not.
Hi, this is actually for Heben. I'm in the unique position where I teach a high school freshman a class called Feminist Literature.
What?
Yeah, I'm very lucky. It's an all-girls school. I got my master's in gender studies and feminist lit from the New School so many years ago, but I'm about to move into sort of third wave, on the edge of fourth wave. And my next question that I was going to consider is Beyonce a feminist? And the reason that I'm bringing this up is it makes me wonder and question to what degree the media has sort of co-opted our visions of feminism in general. And I'm thinking also of Kim Kardashian and this idea that she's sort of confusing feminism with marketing. And so I wondered if any of you could speak to that in terms of your position as media makers, and how has feminism possibly been co-opted by the media, if that makes sense.
There's an epidemic of feminism being co-opted by marketers. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to let Heben speak to that, but there's an epidemic.
Well, I don't know if I can speak to that, actually. I can speak to Beyonce. I don't know about the rest. I'm interested in Kim Kardashian in the respect that she is Northwest's mom, and I'm a big fan of Northwest. Favorite internet baby. So I like her a lot, just mother-daughter wise. I do think there is a narrative about, there was a moment in the 90s where like the Spice Girls were doing girl power. And then, like, Beyonce's had her own very interesting political, personal journey where you can see her growing in terms of, like, what she feels comfortable saying out loud. I do genuinely believe this is her political awakening. Like, I don't think it's, like, an act, even though she's the wisest businesswoman, probably, of all music people. Like, I do believe she knows that it's a selling point these days to have a giant wall behind you that says feminist. That's not an accident. Every single thing she does is like really, really well thought out. So I do know that she knows that we're in a moment right now where if you say you're not a feminist, like people look at you sideways. Even though no one asks this question of men ever. Wild. So I find the question for Beyonce to be a little bit insulting sometimes, to be honest. Because so many black women that I know are like, she captures so much of my life. She gives me so much joy in this world. She lets me articulate things that I can never articulate because it's just in a song form and not, I have to articulate it myself to my peers and my coworkers and et cetera. So I do think she's a feminist. She's like I think she's a classic example of black feminist. But also capitalism, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. You know, like I hear that argument. I'm not impartial to the fact that It's a very particular moment. Like, I don't think Taylor Swift a few years ago would have been such a rah-rah feminist. She's very, very acutely aware of how the market is and what people expect of a woman pop star. So I don't think that's like out of the question. But I do feel like you need to have stronger or more interrogated conversations about your pop stars. Like, everyone has a fave that's problematic. We're all aware with that dynamic. Like, if you like Kim Kardashian, you know what parts of her you don't like and what parts you do like. I don't think it's like incongruous to like pop stars and participate in a capitalist system, which we are all a part of, and also be like, I'm a feminist, I like these parts of her, not these parts of her. I don't think it's that hard to distinguish, honestly.
Yeah. I think there's a real sort of awkward question of, is X feminist? Even when X isn't even a person sometimes, you know, was The Force Awakens feminist? Is Mad Max Fury Road feminist? Movies can't be feminist because they aren't people, so they can't identify as things. And the question is, someone a feminist? It's a feminist, not feminist. That's a question you need to pose to them, not write a think piece about. And really, like, I'm real tired of the think pieces about people responding to the question of whether or not they're a feminist. But yeah, like, it's a weird obsession, and to a certain extent, it's no longer helpful. It's just the essay that everyone's writing for every new thing.
So I'm going to say everybody on this panel is totally done with think pieces.
I mean, I just want to co-sign really quickly what was said, and also say that I think when the question of is X feminist comes up, my question back to that person or a publication is often like, to what end are you asking this question? Because I think too often, like, institutions and white people have been the definers of that word, and it's like no more. So you don't even have the privilege to define that anymore at this point. And so,
just as a side note, so it's a historical fact, when the first Ms. magazine came out, so this is interesting just to touch on this white feminism question that keeps popping up. There was a survey that was done that asked women, did they identify with equal rights? Let's put it there. We're going to paraphrase and not put too many words into 1972 right now. And 40% or less of white women said yes. 60% of black women, because it's 1972, we didn't get that diverse, 60% of black women said yes. And so I think it's very interesting, and it goes back to the question of representation, and I'll throw this back to question and answer, just as a thought for you, for the audience, in that this has never just been a colored movement. And by colored, I mean white or black, or Latino, or AAPI, which is why we mentioned Chicano feminism, third world feminism, sojourner feminism, the different parts of feminism that exist. And so I think it's really interesting, particularly in the representation of media, that we talk about the majority of media that navigates feminism or navigates media in general is white and male. And so it's just interesting, particularly when we look back at the questions that are being asked, is who is asking that question? And I think Lori makes a very good point. Why are they asking that question?
Thanks. One of the things that I think about with feminism is not just the equality, but also it's a lens, it's a prism through which one sees the world. And it's a way of questioning the structures that exist, because most of them are patriarchal, and we all kind of have taken them for granted. And this is where I think it's helpful to everybody, because having those structures questioned are helpful to everyone. The other thing that I wanted to say is that, I'm a second wave and third wave feminist. And to me, the difference between the second wave and the third is, in the second wave, the women's movement has always been different from every other movement because in a peculiar way, and I say this, it's an odd word to use, we're not ghettoized. We have fathers, we have sons, we live with men, many of us, when they're men that we love. And there's a way in which camaraderie could not take place to the extent that it has with other groups who are sort of isolated, and not that that's a good thing, but it causes them to lean upon one another. And the internet, in a way, has done that. It's allowed women to speak outside of their homes, outside of their families, outside of the male relationships that they have. Particularly for women who don't move in feminist circles. So I just wanted to add those pieces.
We have time for 2 more questions, so I'll take one over here. Oh, never mind.
I just think it's amazing that you all have been able to carve out spaces for yourselves in a very white and male dominated field. I'm in a similar field, and I'm curious about what types of things you've looked for in an environment that would allow you to grow and to make this space for yourself, and what allyship looks like, I guess, in a professional sense and a personal sense as a feminist.
I have a question. Can I leave the panel to go to the bathroom? I wanted to ask that in front of everyone so that I could do it. I'm gonna be right back, guys.
Yep. Exercise your autonomy, girl.
Don't mind me.
Allyship is saying yes to bathroom breaks.
I'm always about saying yes. I just got caught off guard. For the rest of the panel, hold it down till she gets back, though. You have to.
Okay, I'll just keep talking. I'll just
You got it.
keep going. I think that's a really great question, and at like your question about translation, I think that's sort of going to be a lifelong question for me personally. But so sorry, can you rephrase your specific question so I speak directly?
I think I'm curious about what has allowed you to carve out a space for yourself, a space for your message inside of a very white and male-dominated field.
Yeah, so originally when I got into journalism, there was a moment where I realized that I have this platform and I could have a lot to say. And at first, I didn't want to go into talking about diversity and feminism because I was just I don't want to have to explain this stuff. I want to be able to write about whatever I want to write about. But I very quickly was drawn to that, and I think in large part because I saw so much misinformation and things that were just, mainstream publications were just getting wrong time and time again. And I felt like if no one else is going to say something, I'm one of the few people who can talk about this with some authenticity, so I would really like to. And I think that's how I became also a better ally to other movements and how I began to identify myself as an intersectional feminist. And I think that for me, I feel sort of lucky that I live in a time where as I think a woman of color, this is maybe, I'm part of one of the first few generations who can do that, actually physically go in and sit and take up the space and be an equal. So I feel like I can't take that for granted, and I realize that things aren't perfect, but I do also sort of feel a little bit, I'm conscious of that history that that wasn't always the case, and so there may be some heavy lifting, and I don't love that I have to do that sometimes. But sorry, this is a really long-winded answer, and I think she's already back from the bathroom, so come back on.
We're waiting
but
on
I think
you, girl.
it's
Come on.
finding those relationships with other people who are existing in the space in the same way you are, and then consciously making decisions and active choices about where you can be and where you want to go to make it a better environment. And I think the choices that I made for my career, like as I move forward in journalism, have always had that in mind. And so like I know there are certain places I would never be okay working with just because that like basic thing, that basic criteria that's very important to me wouldn't be met there.
And just a note for the women who are just about the women that are on this panel. I don't think there is one woman on this panel that has asked if anyone is allowing me to do anything. I would say that every single woman on this panel at one point in time has said, this is missing, it needs to be fixed, and so guess who's gonna fix it? Me. And I think that's something that, you know, I don't let them articulate on that, but knowing their background and that I've stalked them on the internet, just a little bit, they are trailblazers. And the reason why is because, you know, there was either at a point in their careers where they said, okay, you're not gonna allow me to do this, but I'm gonna do this anyway. Or they were like, well, if you're not gonna allow me to do it, I'm gonna find somewhere else where I can. Because if you wait for someone to allow you to do anything, they don't have to do that.
I just want to add one thing. I agree with a lot of what's been said, and I just wanted to say thank you for that question because I think it's a really hard question to ask sometimes in a big group like this. And I don't know what field you're in, you didn't mention, but certain places that are dominated by white men can be very violent places or difficult places, and I definitely have identified that with that feeling over the course of my career, and I think it's really important in whatever space you're working in to support the people of color and the women around you, because even as you move through that and find your own way to say, you know, I won't accept this or I'm going to change that, you know, someone else might be having their own experience that you don't know about. So I think have mentors, be a mentor, really, you know, you have to be in sisterhood with the people that you can be, because those spaces are not easy to navigate and they're not always set up for you. So I just appreciate you asking that question and definitely don't have answers, and still, you know, I'm looking for solutions myself in different ways to navigate spaces that in a lot of ways weren't designed for me.
Thank you so much for this panel. It's been awesome. And Angelique, like if there was a moderator awards in the world, I feel like you'd be winning first place, no doubt. So as we've talked about how the internet has provided unprecedented access for people to access the things that you've created, I think I can speak for a lot of people in this audience that we are also identifying as media makers ourselves. And as a feminist identified media maker myself, I'm very cognizant and aware of the privilege that I have in terms of the point of entry that I have in the feminist conversation at large. I didn't go to a liberal arts school and I didn't have a women's studies program. I went to art school and, you know, I just designed. So I'm often faced with an incredible amount of pressure and sometimes trepidation around what I'm able to actually say without knowing what's happened in history. And I think there's been a lot of criticism around media makers today and the co-opting, as you've said, about this kind of cultural amnesia that seems to happen around feminism. So what, and I guess this is a question that I would love to ask individually, if there were a required reading or if there was a required source of information that each of you could offer up to this audience, what would that be as, you know, this third and fourth wave feminism continues to evolve?
Well, I think we've established that required Googling is D'Angelo, How Does It Feel? Untitled.
Important for feminism.
Okay? Let's just all do that for Heben.
Wait,
that's very important.
And not just the song. You should actually
see
the video.
The video's important. The video is important. No, I mean, like there's so many people whose work I like would want to shout out, and I'm like scared to even start. Feministing has a monthly book review series. Sometimes we publish more than that. That's a really amazing way to find new folks and be introduced to new work. Some people that we recently reviewed The Argonauts by Maggie Nielsen, which is an amazing book that explores like feminism and queer identity and strength and ambition and all these amazing themes. Former columnist Michael Denzel Smith is coming out with a book called Invisible Man Got the Whole World Watching that explores like a lot of like what it means to be a feminist identified man in an age of like police brutality and like growing, coming of age in a time of Trayvon Martin. And he's been a really amazing male ally. Speaking of male allies, I mean, I like, there's so many. I could, maybe we can post some stuff online, but I think checking out like the conversation that's happening among folks on this panel. I personally still like love Twitter. I know there's people who think Twitter might be dying, but I think that Black Twitter is one of my favorite spaces on the internet. I know Heben has shouted that out.
Hard agree.
So I won't. I'm afraid to miss somebody, so I won't name any more in particular. But I think just keeping your eyes open for those folks whose work you're really identifying with, and big upping them and creating community with them is something that I've really enjoyed and got derived a lot of benefit from.
I'm just gonna go ahead and recommend 3 works of fiction. Check out the novels of N.K. Jemisin. She writes incredible fantasy and maybe even some like sci-fi tinged fantasy stuff that takes all of the stuff that we take for granted about Eurocentric fantasy and straight-centric fantasy and male-centric fantasy and flips it over and says we don't have to actually do any of those things, and we can interrogate queerness and we can interrogate race and we can interrogate gender with fantasy stories, not just with science fiction. And I'm going to recommend my #1 comic of 2015, which is Kelly Sue DeConnick and Valentine Delandro's Bitch Planet, which is a deconstruction and a celebration of what women have found empowering in the women in prison genre of film in the form of a comic book. It's on fire. The end of every issue has a essay about feminism and some aspect of feminism from a commentator, an incredibly diverse slew of commentators. And my 3rd one is probably the comic that I'm most excited to pick up this week, which is Black Panther #1 by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I can't remember the name of the artist. Is it Brian Selfries? No? Oh God, I don't even know if that was right in any way. But it looks like it's going to be very good, and I'm very excited about it.
So I can totally relate to where you're coming from because I went to college I studied finance, and my first job was in management consulting, and I knew nothing about feminism. Like, I didn't know what second wave feminism was at all. So I felt like I had to do a lot of catch-up work, and when I started writing, it was just something I became passionate about because it was something I discovered and identified with. So my advice is really not to approach it by looking at some book is going to give you like all the answers or inform you about everything, because it's not. And I think it'll give you maybe 1 or 2 interesting perspectives and you'll learn some facts. But I think that what's important about feminism is acknowledging all the voices and the different styles of thinking and the choices. So like for me, the way I try to stay aware of what's happening is by following a lot of different voices on Twitter and reading a lot of diverse outlets rather than like focusing on a certain book or an academic text that's going to give me a good history. So to me, it's like focusing on a really diverse media diet right now that is encompassing the breadth of the current conversation and thinking about all those different perspectives and how I'm representing them in my own work.
I want to co-sign everything everyone said. Also, Toni Morrison. That's a great place to start, always. We are living in the era of Toni Morrison. We're not celebrating that enough. Living legend. Literally, that's the first place I went.
So true.
Toni knows everything.
I would chime in and also say Roxane Gay. Her TED Talk really, as I was exploring last year, gave me I was able to take a deep breath In particular, there's a TED Talk about not putting feminists on pedestals, and talking about trap music and Beyonce and feminism, because there's a place for that. There is a place for not being the perfect person. So I think, beyond everything else, which, because there is a slew of writings, I think Roxane Gay, it's a great, I mean, she's still living, she's touring, she's doing her thing. All right, so I think that brings us to the end of this amazing panel, and this was incredible, right?